Great. Well, we're picking up at Matthew chapter 2, and I'll read verses 1 to 12. Our speaker today is Mikey Williams. I'll hand over to him in just a moment. Matthew 2, verses 1 to 12. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, 'And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you've found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them, until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Well, over to Mikey.
May I add my welcome to Tom's. Really good to see a number here today and others online as well. Thanks for joining us. My name's Mikey, if we've not met before. Well, it is a bit strange, isn't it, to be considering such a classic Christmas passage in September. I can assure you that Matthew moves us on next week. But I've actually really appreciated the chance to consider the events of Jesus' birth without the seasonal fluffiness and sentimentality that often clouds the mind around Christmas. These passages are no less a part of Matthew's historical account than any other part of his gospel. What we're considering here is real history with timeless truths for us. So I hope you enjoy, as I have, this chance that we have this lunchtime to think of these events, not as just a Christmas tradition, but as God's message with implications for all of us here, and also implications for all those we know and work with. Well, last week we saw Matthew show us how Jesus' virgin birth fulfilled the prophecy of Emmanuel, God coming to be with us to save us from sin. And today Matthew highlights another prophecy being fulfilled. It's there in verse 6 on the service sheet from the prophet Micah this time. "And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Today, Matthew draws our attention to the significance of the Bethlehem babe. I thought that sounded a bit like Israel's latest entrance into Eurovision. But no, Bethlehem has always been long-planned significant for the arrival, the origin of a great ruler, God's promised king. And so Matthew, well, again, he's alerting us here to really the credentials of Jesus as the Christ. First, a virgin birth last week, tick. And now we'll just have a look at his passport, at his place of birth, Bethlehem, tick. This baby really is God's king. God himself come to be with us, to rule his people, the Bethlehem ruler. But if this is the case, well, we would expect Jesus' arrival to make a serious impact. When I was younger, I used to work at the Wimbledon tennis tournament. And one year, it was very special because the Queen came to visit. Now, there are always celebrities around Wimbledon, a VIP there is nothing that new or exciting, but with the Queen, it was very different. Everyone had to get ready. Everything had to get ready. Every bush was pruned, everything was rearranged, all the usual interviews with the players and so on, all went out the window, went on hold. And when she arrived, well, literally everything stopped. She was long awaited. It was her first visit in over 30 years. And so the great and the good all gave way for Her Majesty. All attention was on this little old lady tottering around in a turquoise blue outfit and large hat. Well, that was the effect of royalty arriving. And if that is just earthly royalty, well, what might we expect if divine royalty was really coming to town? That is what Matthew's saying. God's long-awaited king has come. And sure enough, even as a baby, well, Jesus' arrival, it previews, as Matthew will show us here, the monumental impact that he would have as king. So let's dive into the first point that you'll see on the service sheet, which you can find on our website if you're online. A king of global renown. Have a look down from verse 1 of our passage, if you would. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." Well, it's the much-loved story of the wise men bringing their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. But we need to get beyond the stereotypical nativity scenes to really appreciate what is going on here. I mean, we're talking about the most learned people from the known world at the time. And not necessarily just 3 wise men. There may have actually been loads of them. Highly respected, important figures, trekking for days, crossing borders, to come and honor in a foreign land a baby. This is very, very unusual. I mean, sure, British royal babies get quite a fanfare, but even still, you wouldn't get the likes of, I don't know, Angela Merkel or so on, literally trekking across continents on foot to come to their birthday party, would you? This is very bizarre. But the point is that actually this is a supernatural, God-arranged event. I mean, there is some sort of star in the sky that prompted these wise men to embark on this journey. And in verse 9, well, somehow this star goes right before them, directing them to the exact house in Bethlehem where the child was. Some sort of divine GPS tracking agent. I mean, this is clearly God's doing. It's got his fingerprints all over this event. God is making Jesus' arrival known to the world. God wants the nations to know that his king has arrived. This is groundbreaking global news. I've been doing a bit of digging in the book of Micah, which Matthew, as he writes, clearly had in his mind as he's quoting his prophecy of the Bethlehem ruler. And in Micah, well, that prophecy is wrapped up with pictures of foreign nations flowing to Israel and of God's shepherd ruler being great to the ends of the earth. This visit of the wise men also seems to echo the visit of the Queen of Sheba back in Solomon's day in the Old Testament, who came, this queen, similarly with gold and precious spices. And she was praising the Lord for giving his people such a special, astounding king. So I guess the clear message here is that Jesus' rule, if it gets this sort of reaction, well, it is meant to make the whole world sit up and take notice. Jesus' kingship impacts all people in all places. It impacts each one of us listening in today. And it also impacts all those around us, even if they're not listening, even if they have no idea about Jesus. Jesus is a king of global renown. But that leads us to our second point, threatening all other rulers. I don't know if any of you have experienced a workplace merger before. You get two CEOs coming together. And well, I imagine that in the history of that happening, there has been quite a bit of tension caused, friction, difficulty. Well, Matthew really sets up a similar tension here, caused by the arrival of a new king on the scene. Just notice the repetition of king as I read again from verse 1. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, well, behold, wise men came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born king of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Well, when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. All of a sudden, Herod, the existing ruler, is faced with a power struggle. He suddenly has a rival, someone who had been declared king at birth, someone whom wise men had tracked from foreign lands to come and worship. This is a clear threat to Herod's rule. And so we're told Herod is troubled. That's a very strong word. It can mean terrified, agitated, unsettled, thrown into confusion. See, Herod is so threatened that he immediately starts plotting. In verse 4, he assembles his advisors, his religious advisors. And in verse 7, he then summons the wise men to try and work out exactly how old this child is. And the fact that we're told he does so secretly, well, it's a bit of a giveaway at a desperate plan that is already forming in Herod's mind, seeking to destroy this child king and wipe out all opposition. We'll see that more next week. But actually, it's not just Herod who is troubled by Jesus' arrival. It is all Jerusalem with him. Did you notice that? Probably refers particularly to the Jewish religious leaders, the chief priests and scribes and so on, who are, well, they're certainly there in verse 4, aren't they? Now, they were supposed to be the ones preparing the people for the coming of the king. From prophecies like Micah's, they should have been delighted at this news that the wise men brought. And yet, it seems that they were troubled, rather, instead. You see, they held much power over Jerusalem, and now that power, I guess, was threatened. It's a little foretaste of how there would be a great showdown to come that Matthew will show us in the rest of his gospel as Jesus confronts these religious leaders and challenges their authority. But actually, it's not even just the religious leaders necessarily. It also seems just to be, from the way it's phrased, just all people generally in Jerusalem who were troubled by the news of a new king. See, the average Joe didn't want the status quo upset either. And I think that basically fits with most people's experience. None of us, I think, really like, naturally, being told what to do. We all like doing essentially what we want, in the way that we want, when we want, and not really to have to answer to that many other people. But with Jesus' arrival, well, there is a new king on the scene, a new boss to listen to, and it challenges our inherent self-reliance. See, the ultimate king has come, and all other rulers must give way. But this shouldn't be bad news. This should be brilliant news because of our third point, the true shepherd of God's people. As we've seen, Matthew is lining Jesus up as Micah's long-promised king from Bethlehem. The end of verse 6 again, "For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel." This language of a shepherd ruler runs throughout the book of Micah. It's set in contrast to the bad shepherds, the bad leaders who had failed in their job of leading God's people. Israel's leaders at the time had led the people astray, and as a result, God was going to judge them all, sending them off into exile. And yet in Micah, God had promised to gather the remnant of his people like sheep in a fold, and that he himself would lead them back and protect them through his shepherd king. Micah 5:4 says, "He shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, and they shall dwell secure." So what does this shepherd image tell us about Jesus? Well, it tells us that he is the real deal. He is God's true leader. Unlike all those other shepherds, this is the true shepherd. When Queen Elizabeth arrived at Wimbledon and I was working there was no doubting whatsoever that she was the real deal. It wasn't like one of those slightly obscure kings or queens from Belgium or Luxembourg or somewhere that no one over here has ever really heard of. Apologies if you're from Belgium or Luxembourg. But no, this was the queen, the undisputed true monarch of the land. And in the same way, well, Jesus, he is the true king. He is the real deal. I mean, he has God's own backing, 100%. That's made clear in our passage, I think, as we see God's sovereign hand directing all of these events. I mean, first, God had signaled Jesus' kingship with a miraculous star. And then in verse 12 at the end, the wise men, well, they're warned in a dream not to return to Herod, to foil his wicked plan. You see, God is ensuring that Jesus is established as king of his people. And that means that if Jesus is the real deal, the true shepherd, that means he won't fail in his task of leading the people as others had failed. This shepherd, Jesus, has divine strength to lead his people in the right way and to fully protect them. But to fully protect them, well, that meant needing to protect them from themselves. Because ultimately, it was their own sin that had led them on a trajectory towards judgment. They were guilty as well as the leaders. And so this shepherd, well, what he really needed to do was to lead people to God's forgiveness. Micah ends his book with a wonderful promise that this would happen. "Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over transgression for the remnant of his inheritance? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in steadfast love. He will again have compassion on us. He will tread our iniquities underfoot. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea." Now, Micah didn't know exactly how God could deal with his people's sins like that. But of course, Matthew is going to go on to give us the full picture. Last week we got a taste as we read, "You shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." See, just as I guess a shepherd was expected to lay down his life to save his sheep, well, so too, of course, Jesus would lay down his life at the cross. It's possible even that the gift of myrrh that is given to Jesus, even at this stage, a baby, is a little pointer towards Jesus' death. Myrrh was a spice used for embalming dead bodies, including Jesus's 30 years later. And so Micah's quote of a shepherd, well, it eventually drives us towards the cross, because that is where Jesus fully fulfills this role of the shepherd. That is where he delivers his people from the problem of their sin. That is where he protects them from danger by facing the judgment that they deserved in their place. This is what God's true king would do. the one who would truly shepherd his people. But what does Matthew want us to do with this? How does he want his readers to respond to this groundbreaking news that God's long-promised king has come? Well, I think the trusty repetition tool seems to highlight the right response for us, which I think is to worship Jesus. See, Matthew notes it 3 times. End of verse 2, the wise men, we have come to worship him. End of verse 8, Herod says, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. And although Herod obviously was lying, well, the wise men show that they meant what they said in verse 11. Going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. I like that reference to Mary there. I don't know, perhaps Joseph was out, but just imagine what Mary must have thought as these well-dressed foreign dignitaries came knocking on her door. Remember, possibly many more than 3, no doubt with a long train of animals to carry all of their expensive cargo, these precious gifts that they'll present to them. And they literally fall down and prostrate themselves flat on their face in front of her little baby boy. It's an extraordinary image, isn't it? Notice, not before Mary, they worship Jesus alone. We would have thought that it would have been far too humiliating an act for such important men to give such a visual declaration of this little baby being so much greater than them. It's very self-lowering, without reserve. They give him their service and adoration. And yet we're told that they do it gladly. In verse 10, they rejoice exceedingly with great joy when they reach the house. They just can't wait to fall down before this child, because they are convinced that he is God's king. If you're new to Christian things, the idea of worshipping anyone or anything probably sounds a bit weird and maybe a bit extreme. But what the Bible tells us about Jesus, well, it actually leaves us with very limited ways to respond rightly. There's no real moderate middle ground. The famous author C.S. Lewis said it like this of Jesus: you can shut him up as a fool, you can spit at him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. You see, if Jesus really is God's long-promised king, then surely falling at his feet and calling him God, worshipping him, is the only logical option. I guess the only other real option is to reject Jesus' rule for whatever reason. We'll see Herod does that, and we'll see how futile next week that is. See, Matthew, I think, wants us to see that the wise men, their reaction, well, is actually the wise reaction. But what exactly should it look like to worship him? Well, I think the definition from our passage today would simply be to accept Jesus as the ultimate king, as our king personally. See, Herod and those in Jerusalem, they weren't prepared to do this. They didn't like the idea of having someone else with authority over them calling the shots of their life. But rightly responding to God's king, well, this is where it has to start. Laying aside our natural desire to want to run our own life without really any reference to God, and instead accepting Jesus as our rightful ruler. That is basically what it means to become a Christian. Putting our trust in Jesus and putting him in the driving seat of our lives. Not just sort of intellectually acknowledging him, but personally embracing him. Not trying to limit his impact on our lives to the bare minimum, but rather seeking to serve and to live for Jesus in every area of our life. should certainly be much more than just what we do on a Sunday or at the lunchtime talks. J.C. Ryle spoke of how so-called public worship church services must translate into the rest of our lives if they're to be of any value. He said, "The best public worship is that which produces the best private Christianity." If we want to know whether our own public worship is doing us good, let us try it by these tests. Does it quicken our conscience? Does it send us to Christ? Does it sanctify our life? If it does, we may depend on it. It is true worship. You see, God's King deserves more than just a bit of formality a day or two a week. Worshipping Jesus is something that should impact our whole lives, wherever we are. See, when the Queen came to Wimbledon, literally everything was rethought in light of her impending coming, every detail. And in a similar way, worshipping, living for Jesus as our King, it's likely to change any number of things day to day. Our ambitions, how we spend our time, what we want most for our family, how much perhaps we care about our reputation and status at work, what we're willing to speak to our colleagues about. I mean, if Jesus is King over all peoples, there's not a person that we'll interact with this week who doesn't owe him their devotion as well. So how might that affect us as his followers? Of course, even the most mature, long-standing Christian will often fail to worship Jesus as we should. There'll often be times when we totally lose sight of living for Jesus. I know that happens to me sometimes, and we sort of catch ourselves slipping back into simply serving ourselves. And on the one hand, we mustn't beat ourselves up and feel too guilty about that. After all, if we're trusting Jesus, we know that he has cast our sins into the depths of the sea. We'll always be simply sheep in need of him to lead us as our shepherd. But on the other hand, I'm not sure that Matthew would want us to let ourselves off too easily just by saying, it's inevitable that we won't be able to do this very well. I think Matthew wants us to keep looking at Jesus. He's got 28 chapters of his gospel for us. He wants us to remember and to be struck again and again just at how Jesus is God's long-promised King. And in light of that, to press on as wholeheartedly as we can, continue, seeking to assess how we might revolve everything in our lives around him. That may sound quite daunting. But like the wise men, I think we'll find that if we have a right view of Jesus as the ultimate ruler, and if we're acting in light of that, it won't be a chore. It will rather seem a real joy, because we'll know for sure that we are secure in the care of God's mighty shepherd. Let me close our time now, if I would, with a short prayer. Father, thank you so much that in Jesus, the ultimate King has come. Thank you for your faithfulness in fulfilling your promise of sending a ruler who would be great to the ends of the earth and who would shepherd your people perfectly. Please help us to relinquish our natural desire to rule ourselves and to see it as a great joy rather to live for Jesus. Amen.